Country-related disparities in clinical trial inclusion is a topic very dear to me, as I struggle with it every day in practicing in a small European country. This is a map of distribution of study locations of all trials registered in clinicaltrials.gov a couple of years ago. And if green is the least clinical trials and red is the most, you see how obviously most of the Southern Hemisphere and most of Asia are in the least, and the United States and Europe are obviously with higher numbers. Looking at FDA regulated investigators, we see that things are getting better over the last 15 years or so, but still, while in 1998, 84% of FDA regulated investigators were in the US and Canada and North America, it's now down to 61% as of 10 years ago. I don't have more recent data, but it's still a very large difference between what's in Western Europe and emerging regions. And less than 3% of all cancer patients will enroll in a clinical trial, even in the countries that have many trials running. And less or about 1.3% of African Americans will enroll in clinical trials. And you already heard a wonderful talk on race and gender disparities. Now, on the other hand, if you look at what the global pharmaceutical market is expected to be in a couple of years from now, you see that the countries that have the more trials also have a very high expenditure in regards to pharmaceuticals, although Europe is second to the Eastern countries of Asia in that regard. So I'm going to look at two aspects. I'm going to look at the aspect of disparities within Europe and then disparities at a more world level. So regarding the European disparities in access to oncology clinical trials in Europe, a very interesting and relevant trial was presented at ESMO in 2020 by Ana Carneiro that looked at the clinicaltrial.gov studies that were registered in Europe. Please note that for multi-centered trials, of which we have many in Europe, each country was counted as having the same trial once. So if a trial was run in 3 countries, it was counted as 3 trials. And we see that there's 18,454 trial entries in Europe, of which the vast majority is either phase 2 or phase 3, with only very few phase 1 and phase 2. And you see that the distribution in Europe is quite varied. Basically, countries between France, Germany, Spain, the UK, Italy, Belgium, and the Netherlands have have a lot of clinical trial entries compared to countries in Eastern and Southern Europe that have much fewer, as you see up here. And if you look at this percentage by 100,000 inhabitants, very interestingly, Belgium is very impressive at the highest level, and subsequently is Denmark, with the rest of the countries as you see here. But countries like mine have very few clinical trials per 100,000. Here you see the same study showing us how this is different by region within Europe per 100,000 inhabitants, and the differences between Northern and Western Europe versus Eastern and Southern Europe are quite impressive. There are twice as many studies in Northern and it's particularly Western Europe compared to the rest of the countries. Most of the studies are almost evenly distributed between early and late phase, 2 to 3, except for Eastern Europe, where there seem to be more late phase trials. Looking at the same data with 100 per 100,000 inhabitants by GDP, what you see here is that the poorer countries, Albania, Montenegro, Bulgaria, have very few studies, and the wealthier with higher GDP countries have more clinical trials per 100,000 population. And you look at the same data by cancer incidence, and you also see a lower cancer incidence in some of these countries. But I wonder, and I know that in Greece this is true, whether this is a matter of how well the registries are kept and how actual truth we can attribute to these numbers for cancer incidence. Clinical trial entries in Europe have not varied tremendously over the last decade. It seems there's been a bit of an increase around 2015, but not really huge differences. And I hope you can see, because I'm blocked here by the little, hang on, let me see if I can remove it. Okay. What you see here is that some countries that have relatively few studies have had a significant growth in the numbers, but they're still in very low absolute numbers. So why do patients not why do trials do not make it in Europe? One of the major problems to the small countries, one of the major problems is that trials in general have a difficult time completing in time, enrolling patients, and a lot of the sites do not enroll any patients or enroll very few, and that costs a lot. So the pharmaceutical industry does not want to support trials that are not going to run in places where they're not going to run well. I think that's one of the reasons this happens. The second is that's probably the credibility of data deriving from a smaller country may not be the same as the credibility of data coming from a very auspicious, famous Western European or North American institution. But looking at the more objective things, which are the dollars and cents, when a site doesn't perform, it still costs a whole lot of money for the pharmaceutical industry, and that is one of the major concerns that the industry has when they are not including some of our countries. Also, mind you, in order to start a study running in a certain country, just to start that country is a significant cost. If that country is relatively small, the cost of opening the country, quote unquote, is not proportionate to the number of patients that could be accrued if there's a small population and a very few academic centers. This is a slide offered to me by LACOG, the Latin American Cooperative Oncology Group, showing their struggle with starting studies in breast cancer, even though they're a very large group, in Latin America, in South and Central America. And a lot of their ideas have been declined or are on hold. They have repeatedly expressed their frustration about the fact that a lot of their concept proposals are not approved. 90% is rejected. There's very limited budget for investigator-initiated research in the local representatives of pharmaceutical companies. There's basically restricted access to global level budget discussions, and a lot of the concepts that are relevant to the low and middle income countries are not so important for the pharmaceutical industry, so they don't want to run studies in those topics. On the other hand, academic studies, non-pharma run studies, would involve a budget that is frequently not available in the low and the middle income countries. So why is there difficulty in running these studies? Well, there is a lot of doubt about the human capacity, the human capacity to run the trial. There's lack of funding, lack of skilled personnel, lack of awareness and motivation. There are major regulatory system obstacles. I think in Greece, this is a major issue. The state infrastructure for approvals, the ethics committees and such are very slow and bureaucratic and almost averse to studies. There's lack of infrastructure in running, for example, phase 1 studies. The scientific atmosphere is not very conducive. The administrative system is not supportive. And there's so many competing demands that there's really very little time for the researchers to do their job. Now, on the side of the business aspect of the pharmaceutical companies, what we see is that they invest mostly in the United States, less so in Europe, in Japan, and other OECD countries. And you see that where the pharma invests more, also the government, which is the lighter blue, also invests more. So one brings the other rather than one compensating for the other. So we discussed a little bit about the potential to run studies in small countries or low middle income countries compared to high income countries. And I alluded once to the fact that also the topics of the studies may be a bit different. So what's of interest in low middle income countries has very limited interest for high income countries many times. And there's very few topics that are relevant for both and give the option for co-development, both in high and low income countries. The research priorities and the research allocation for less advanced countries may be different because the cancer incidence is different. So what you see in this slide is that different malignancies, such as, for example, rectosigmoid cancer, is less interesting to low middle income countries compared to high income countries, because this is a malignancy that is more common to high income countries. And on the other hand, financing is geared usually to those tumors that have a higher incidence in higher income countries. So this already creates a disparity right there. Looking at clinical trials initiated between 2014 and 2019 in Europe, you see that regarding advanced technology, medical products, most of these trials are run in Western Europe, with very few trials happening in Eastern Europe. And here you see trials that have to do with gene delivery and gene therapy and gene editing are obviously more in North America and somewhat in Asia, and even in Western Europe, they're not as easy to run. And they're particularly run in Israel at a very high rate. Belgium and Denmark, as I said before, are high performers within the European area. Very few such trials will be encountered in our countries. You see one or two only. And most of these studies are higher phase, very few phase 1 trials are done. So you're getting the picture of how this is a problem. Now, the criteria that most industry use to select a country to run a study in it are obviously the expertise and skills of the clinical centers, the speed of approval, the health authorities, and both the quality of their review and their expertise, the place of establishment, the country of origin of the research that's being tested, the costs, and the potential of the market. And that might be a niche for smaller but populous countries to press on and have more studies, because they will be future markets, obviously. Approval times, as I alluded to before and referred to you in regards to my own country as well, vary tremendously. And in most European countries, they're between 3 and 6 months, but many other countries can have more than a year even. That is extremely unattractive to those running the trials. And here, looking at this same data by country, you see that Greece and Portugal and Poland, we are amongst the countries that have very few studies, and part of it is the speed or lack of speed for study initiation. On a global scale, the number of trials for advanced technology medical products increased over that period, but you see that most of that increase happened in North America, in Asia, and less so in Europe. So why is Europe doing a little bit less well? There's fragmentation of the regulatory bodies and ethical committees. The lack of harmonization across the different countries makes for a difference. There's lower levels of investment and risk capital, but we're all looking forward to the Clinical Trial Directive 2001/20/EC, which may allow to decrease the delays and homogenize the landscape of approvals throughout Europe, and that will make our ability to run studies much better, because the decisions right now are very different from country to country and frequently delayed. Now, why should we bother? Obviously, from the side of the countries, the quicker access to innovation is a good reason to have studies. There's an influx of funds. There's opportunities for scientific and academic development. We can assess the efficacy of in a specific population. Not all populations are the same, as you just heard from the previous speaker. Research of certain diseases that are not prevalent in high-income countries can be done only in the countries where the diseases are prevalent. And patients are treated on trial, according to some of the data that I've seen, enjoy better care overall. From the side of the pharmaceutical companies, they should be interested in opening more countries because it's bringing their products to those markets. Some of these countries can run the studies for a lower cost. It confirms the efficacy in all populations, accesses emerging target markets, and allows for faster recruitment. How can this be improved? National cancer control plans, something promoted by the UICC and WHO, are important in improving the function of a country and the access to clinical trials and to doing research. Guidelines help. Centers for research help. Efficient framework for trial approval and monitoring on the state level is important. Ethics committees and infrastructure for study conduct are obviously very important. And we've seen that Belgium and Denmark, without being very large countries, have implemented policies that have made for fast approval and have created clinical trials offices that are disease specific, that have facilitated trial conduct. So in closing, I want to say that developing countries should be enabled to acquire the know-how and technology to participate more actively in the development of products that they need, as very well said in this bulletin of the WHO. And I'd like to thank you for your attention.